So here's a path that I'm going to build using a locally supplied random slate, basically rebuilding an old pathway that used to exist. So here's the old path. It's concrete that was effectively smashed to create a crazy paving look. Because of its age, it's been filled in with bitumen, etc. So we're going to pull it all out and start again. So here I've dug up the old pathway. I've created the necessary formwork for the new path using 75mm 3-inch strips of plywood, which are about 6 to 8mm thick. It needs to be able to bend for the curved aspect of the path. Basically a regular 8x4 foot plywood sheet cut down. And for the stakes, I've used a roofing batten, which is roughly 25 by 50mm, cut to 12-inch long and created a sharpened end on them. I've also mixed some engine oil with white spirits and applied it to the inside face of the plywood strips to stop any binding to the mortar when I take the formwork off. Although, given it's new plywood, it's smooth enough to get away from not really doing that. The screws have been fixed from the inside face of the plywood strips to the stakes, so any excess screw length doesn't end up in the mortar, which creates issues with removal of the formwork. If the passes are fixed along the whole length, then it'll pay to cut a length of batten and use that as a width indicator, and otherwise you'll be pulling out your tape measure all the time to keep the path formwork equidistant. Note also that I have the top of the plywood strips where I want the top of the path to be. It is my height guide. I also want the path in total to be 75mm 3-inch or more in depth, which is adequate for walking on without any problem strength-wise. Generally, you don't want a path to be lower than the surrounding lawn, as it will act as a channel when it rains or gets ice, etc. A lot of people simply put the new path on top of the old path, so it will end up quite a bit higher than the surrounding lawn, but that's your choice. In this situation, I've been quite lucky as the base bedding for the old path is suitable for a new path. It is compacted enough that I don't have to put down any base layer and compact it. I was very careful with removing the old concrete to keep it undisturbed. Then I got all the stone pieces and sorted through them to ensure a distribution of colour. Also cut them and initially positioned them. As you can see, all the straight sides of the stone pieces I put along the edge, and then in the middle of the path I did more cutting of stones to ensure a good fit. The ideal distance between the stones where you see the mortar is roughly about 1 inch. Same too along the edge where it meets the formwork. You need about 1 inch of mortar to ensure it doesn't break or fall off. From cutting the stones, I used a small handheld battery grinder with a diamond masonry blade. Always use eye protection and suitable dust mask, and preferably ear protection as well. In terms of cutting the stones, I used a builder's crayon and drew the curves in that I wanted to achieve. Effectively, I laid the stones over each other and then worked out how much I needed to take off the edges to make them all fit. You need to get it a suitable sort of it needs to look natural. So you essentially need to work with the stonework and use some artistic license. So here's the stones laid with the bedding mortar underneath them. I've used a 4-to-1 mix of sand and cement. In other words, 4 parts sand, 1 part cement. I've left sufficient space for the final grey mortar to effectively grout between the stones, as I want that coloured grey. As you can see, the stones are flush with the top of the profile plywood edging strip. You can use a level or straight edge piece of timber to tamp down the stones into the bedding mortar as you lay them. Bedding mortar needs to be quite a firm mix, as it needs to support the stones, which in my case are quite heavy. In addition to a mix of firm mortar, I also use some spare aggregate stones and sort of jam them underneath the stones to lift them with the mortar to lift the stones to the appropriate height. You'll need a bucket of clean water and a big sponge to clean the surface of the stones, otherwise you'll end up with cement staining on the surface, which detracts from the look, and that's quite important for that type of slate look. Then I finally went over the slate and filled in the recessed joints and edges. You can use mortar toner to get the colour you desire. I would strongly suggest you make enough in one batch to do the whole path, as getting the correct colour matches between batches is harder than it looks, even with strict quantity measurements of toner. Note also that the container of cement toner may make reference to the ratio of cement, which is not the total volume including the sand. A further point is use plastering sand or other finishing sand to get a clean surface finish with the mortar grout. I didn't, and it was a pain to deal with. Once again, continually wash the surface of the stones with a bucket of clean water and sponge, trying not to get too much water running down the path. Then I let the path set for a couple of days and then went over it with patio sealer. This will improve the look, although it wears off quicker than I'd like. Then after a day or two more, you can remove all the wooden formwork sides and stakes and put soil around the edges of the path, and then it's all finished.